Ancient and Modern Britons, Chapter 6, book by David McCritchie. This chapter will discuss the following: Mull fashions 400 years ago, the Buckram suits and mantles, ancient coats of arms, humans, beasts and the Shelly-Coat Cows, adders and beads, the North British Cannibals, bloody customs, other heathen traits, and start of chapter. It was seen that the marsh dwellers of the 4th district who fought against Severus were, according to Herodian, accustomed to dispense with clothing in time of war, although they may at other times have worn the mantle or plaid, like the Irish of 1,000 years later, or more probably the skin garments of the Hungarians and the long-haired Getae. This indifference to clothing was continued up to within comparatively recent times among certain tribes, whose precise lineage it is difficult to determine. Walter Espay, a great Norman baron, who came over with William the Conqueror in 1066, in a speech by him to the Anglo-Norman army, previous to the Battle of Cowton Moor, after mentioning the former successful exploits by them against the Scots, added that they should rather laugh than fear against such as the vile Scot, who half-naked comes forward to fight, and that to the Norman swords and spears they oppose their naked hide, using a calfskin for a shield. And the writer just quoted, who, curiously enough, is endeavouring to prove the great antiquity of the Highland garb, as now worn, previously cites Herodian and also Dio, who, writing in the year 230 AD, says the Caledonians are hardly clothed and dwell in tents and without shoes. He also gives the phrase used by Eumenius in 296, hostibus seminudis, or meantime are half-naked enemies, adding that Logan, in his work on the Guile, also quotes from the very ancient classical author, namely Herodian, to the same effect that from the apparently scanty clothing of the Caledonian Guile the expression naked was not inapplicable. Assuredly not. And he further states that Gildas in the 6th century says that the Picts were only dressed with cloth round the loins. His argument is an astonishing instance of the force of preconceived ideas and lion national prejudice, for by such quotations he believes that he is establishing the antiquity of the dress now called Highland. There is no confusion as to nomenclature, for he asserts that the Picts were the ancestors of the Gaels, and he, unintentionally, shows that so recently as the year 1688 the islanders of Mull wore the plaid as a mantle, and not in any fashion as a kilt. The evidence given is from the account of William Sacheverell Esq, governor of the Isle of Man, who speaks of the dress of the Mull people in the following terms: the usual outward habit of both sexes is the plaid, the women's much finer, the colours more lively, and the squares larger than the men's, and put me in mind of the ancient Picts. This serves them for a veil and covers both head and body. The men wear theirs after another manner, especially when designed for ornament. It is loose and flowing, like the mantles our painters give their heroes. Their thighs are bare, with brawny muscles. Nature has drawn all her strokes bold and masterly, a thin brogue on the foot, a short buskin of various colours on the leg, tied above the calf with a striped pair of garters. What should be concealed is hid with a large shot pouch, on each side of which hangs a pistol and a dagger, a round target on their backs, a blue bonnet on their heads, in one hand a broadsword and a musket in the other. The writer of this account, Sacheverell, is perfectly unbiased, and his attitude toward the people he describes is one of admiration and not of provincial spitefulness. For he speaks in the highest terms of their noble qualities, their contempt of luxury and ambition, their courage, their temperance, and the graceful modesty of their women. But the dress of the men, as pictured by him, has some affinity with that of a Zulu warrior. The modern kilt does not form any portion of it, although, fortunately, the sporran does. It seems doubtful whether the rival clans, in their famous duel at Perth in the year 1396, wore anything more cumbersome than their weapons, and possibly, to give them the benefit of the doubt, the breechcloth worn according to Gildas by the painted Moors of the 6th century. The Perth combatants are stated by a writer of the reign of James II. Of Scotland to have entered the lists, armed only with swords, bows and arrows, without mantles or other armour except axes. A mantle is here clearly understood to be equivalent to armour, and the probability is that the custom among those tribes, as among the Irish of Spencer's time, was to wrap it about their left arm instead of a target, it being in this shape hard to cut thorough with a sword. And since the Irish Carne of Queen Elizabeth's day was, by this use of his plaid, left untrammelled by any other garment whatsoever, it seems likely that the kindred Highlandman of 2 centuries earlier, who followed the same usage, was also alike in other respects. Other fashions, and likely other races, are described thus by the historian John Major, who wrote in 1512, "From the middle of the thigh to the foot, they have no covering for the leg, clothing themselves with a mantle instead of an upper garment, and a shirt dyed with saffron. In time of war they cover their whole body with a shirt of mail of iron rings, and fight in that." This description seems to be that of the semi-Norse Highlanders of the West, and it would appear that their chiefs only are so indicated, for the very next sentence says, "The common people of the Highland Scots rush into battle, having their body clothed with a linen garment, manifoldly sewed and painted or daubed with pitch, with a covering of deerskin." Here the plaid receives no notice at all, and the pitch-painted garment reminds one more of Falstaff's men in Buckram suits than of a modern deerstalker, whose outward appearance has positively nothing in common with the Highland Scot, just figured, unless the covering of deerskin be construed to mean a sporran, as it likely enough does. This pitch-painted dress seems to have been worn 30 years later by a contingent of Highlanders who, with a body of French auxiliaries, and with other Scots besieged the town of Haddington, then garrisoned by the English. The Scottish portion of the army seems to have been half Norse, and the account given of their appearance tends to confirm the conjecture that the mail-clad warriors pictured in the above quotation were Islesmen of mixed breed. A considerable body of Scots from the islands of Orkney and the south, who were assembled at Edinburgh in obedience to the Queen Mother's commands, joined the French camp. They wore coats of mail, says the journalist Beag. Each had a large bow in his hand, and their quivers, swords, and shields hung as it were in a sling. They were followed by several Highlanders, and these last go almost naked. They have painted waistcoats and a sort of woolen covering variously coloured, and are armed as the rest with large bows, broadswords, and targets. There was not one of them but gave convincing proofs that they stood in no awe of the English. In this case the plaid is mentioned as well as the suit of Buckram, but as to the disposing of the plaid there is nothing to show whether it was worn as a mantle only, or belted so as to form a kilt as well. The former fashion seems more likely, considering what has already been said. If it had been arranged as a kilt, the expression "almost naked" would be wholly unsuitable. Even when the kilt began to be evolved, its growth was gradual. There is a portrait of a Highland chief of the 16th or 17th century, prefixed to the history of his family, one of some note, in which the kilt he there displays is only about half as long as that demanded by modern fastidiousness. If a chief then, dressed for a portrait painter, was so scantily clad as regards his lower man, what sort of figures were his gillies likely to be in their work-a-day's suits? I fancy the old song stated a most apparent fact, when it peopled the Highlands with lang-legged callants, gone wanting the breeks, and without hose and shoon. This latter point is noted by Dr. Johnson as a feature in the appearance of the Highlanders of a time so recent even as his. He remarks, when at Inverness, the numbers that go barefoot are still sufficient to show that shoes may be spared. They are not yet considered as necessaries of life. For tall boys, not otherwise meanly dressed, run without them in the streets. And in the islands the sons of gentlemen pass several of their first years with naked feet. Probably the earliest dress ever worn in these islands, as an advance upon the mere breech-cloth described by Gildas, and the leafy cincture of the heraldic savage, was that which found favour among the nobles of the long-haired Getsy and the ancient Hungarians of whom Gibbon speaks. This was the skin of some wild animal which seems to have been worn much in the same fashion as that customary among the Dyaks of Borneo, except that the head of the animal was drawn over the head of the wearer of the skin, one of the supporters of the coat armorial of the ancient family of Quaville, probably intended to represent an actual savage slain by an ancestor of that family, gives one a good idea of the fashion. The above woodcut exhibits it. Now this fashion, simple enough in its way, is really of great interest, for it is the very germ of heraldry, or if that title belongs more to the tattooed emblem of the naked Pict, at any rate the wild beast's skin, thus worn, was the first coat of arms. The legendary heroes of the Highland tales used to wear a coachal or husk, which was believed to have the power of transforming them into animals of various kinds, but when the heroes came home to their dwellings, they put off this coachal and became men. This was written in the West Highland Tales. A survival of this may be seen in the New Year's custom described by Dr. Johnson when staying at Col. One man dresses himself in a cow's hide, upon which other men beat with sticks. He runs with all this noise round the house, which all the company quits in a counterfeited fright. Thus the wearer became identified with the animal whose skin he wore, and it is to this custom that we owe the origin of so many animal names used as surnames. Mr. Grant Allen has pointed this out lately, and shown that not only are there very many English towns and other localities, as well as family names, still bearing the names of birds, beasts, fishes, or plants, but also the bearers of such names did actually at one time believe themselves to be lineally and literally descended from the original of their family totem. The birds, fishes, and plants must, of course, have been gradually assumed in course of time and then only as crests. But the animal's skin was plainly, to judge from the tradition and other evidence, the beginning of the idea, and farther it was apparently not worn at home, but only when on the warpath, as the Dyak custom still is. It was a coat of arms, and the wearer was known to men of another tribe by the name of the animal of his clan. This is seen over and over again, both in history and in legend. There was a king of Scotland, or more properly Alban, in the 10th century, who is known simply as Cuilian or Caniculus, the whelp, and another as Carly Hunderson, the son of the dog. The legendary Cuchulainn, many centuries before the historic Cuilian, is often spoken of simply as An Cu, or Tijai Hound, and sometimes as Cu Nan Con, or the Hound of the Tribe of the Hounds, while one of the old Irish kings bore the title of Cairbar of the Cat's Head. Mr. O'Curry states that the Conchanaik or Dogheads were an ancient race who inhabited Mag O'Coin Chin, which seems to be the marsh of the Dogheads, now Moigonihi in Kerry, and this race, along with a tribe of cats, and another wearing the hides of some white-backed animal, are evidently the actors in a very ancient Gaelic poem in which the following lines occur. When 3 battalions were seen, sons to the king of Rualay, cat-headed one battalion was. Dog-headed was the one beside it. The other behind them was white-backed, brown the rest, though white the back. The whole of the cat-heads were killed, the dog-heads we seized to a man, the whole of the white-backs fell. The scene of this poem is laid in Ireland, and the reciters of it are supposed to be Finn, or Fionn, and his followers, who were, according to Mr. O'Curry, sworn enemies to the Doghead tribe. Other examples are to be found in the Daubi Munalugi Gai and Cata Merte, whom Ptolemy places in the modern county of Sutherland, and whose names are probably, thinks Mr. Skene, the Gaelic Leuch, a calf, and Mart, a heifer. A dynasty of the ancient Mormaers or Earls of Buchan bore also the title of Mac Dobhakon, or the children of the water dog, or otter. The Cats, a race which must have at one time inhabited a large part of Europe, are still represented by the Highland clan Chattan. And not only did this fashion of personating a real animal appertain to the days when men clothed themselves in the actual hide, it was continued after metal armour came into use. Or it may be that the metal-using and skin-using peoples were contemporaneous. At any rate, so far as the covering of the head is concerned. The ancient Gauls are said to have worn helmets which represented beasts, not merely a crest worn above the helmet, but a helmet shaped into the semblance of a beast, which, wholly enveloping the head of the wearer, made him visibly a dog head, cat head, or whatever his totem was. This is distinctly seen in certain bronze plates which were discovered some time ago in Iceland, and which are represented in Mr. Du Chaillu's Land of the Midnight Sun. Two of the figures in these plates are intended either to denote the same individual twice over, for they are almost identical, or else two members of the same clan, and their crests, the complete figure of a boar, is only worn above the helmet. But of two others, one has his head encased in a metal boar's head, with eye-holes on either side, and his comrade is crowned with a large pair of cow's horns, apparently metal also. Specimens of such head cases have been found in Scotland and have been described in the Rind Lectures of 188-1. The one is a boar's head like the Iceland warriors, and the jaws are contrived so as to open and shut by hinges at each side. There are also eye-holes on each side, though it is likely the wearer would depend rather on the view obtained through the large half-open mouth, lined with metal tusks. The other Scotch head-case has the horns of an antelope, or some animal of that kind. Such head-pieces, though only of skin, are to some extent worn among the Chukches of Siberia. Often, the skin of the hood is so chosen that the ears of the animal project on both sides of the head. And this is apparently what is meant by an Irish tradition that, at a battle fought near Ballybeg Abbey, County Cork, in the time of all the battles, there was a giant killed there that had a horse's ears. Indeed, this grotesque fashion explains away a great many things. The furies of heraldry who have pointed brute-like ears may have originated in this, unless they are witnesses to the truth of evolution, and all the other wise impossible stories, in West Highland and other tales, of animals speaking and associating with men, of people assuming the shapes of various animals by enchantment, of werewolves or men-wolves, of witches who become cats, of the dragons and boars and other scaly monsters against whom the heroes of old fought, the scales being, as Mr. Carl Blind suggests, scale armour, worn by the Norwegian and Danish conquerors. All these are testimonies to the time when men, whether as individuals or as clans, were known by the name of the beast which was their totem. And it is in this custom much more likely than in any mythological belief that we shall find the solution of the antelope-headed and otherwise brute-headed human figures which are seen not only in Scotland and in Norway, but which are carved also upon the rocks of Egypt and of the Drakenberg. Such representations were the simplest and most natural way of betokening the kindred of the subject of the sculpture. The cowskin covering remarked upon by Dr. Johnson at the island of Cole was probably worn by a race of men inimical to the forefathers of those who drubbed the temporary wearer of it, not knowing why they did so. Indeed, it is a most likely hypothesis that, if the indigenous tribes of interior England and western Scotland wore their beast-skin garments after the same fashion as the savage of the Colville Shield, the particular hide most commonly used would be that of a cow or a bull, because they are described as a pastoral cattle-owning people, and in fact there is a traditionary proof that this was so. In the Cornish tale of Tom the Giant and Jack the Tinkeard, the garment of the latter is thus described. Popular romances of the west of England. It was made out of a shaggy black bull's hide, dressed whole with the hair on. The skin of the forelegs made the sleeves, the hindquarters only were cut, pieces being let in to make the spread of the skirts, while the neck and skin of the head formed a sort of hood. The whole appeared as hard as iron, and when Tom hit the Tinkeard, it sounded, as if the coat roared, like thunder. Such a coat, it is said, was never seen in the West Country before, which makes it still more likely that this Tinkeard or Tinker, belonged to the Aborigines of the interior. It is further stated in the legend that after the Tinkeard had fraternized with Tom and his family, he taught his hostess how to make a similar coat for her son. So a bull-calf's skin was put onto the boy, and Jane had special instructions how she was to allow the coat to dry on his back and tan and dress it in a peculiar way. The skin thus treated would shrink and thicken up until it came to his shape. In this way, the wearer of such a hide would resemble the animal itself as closely as a man could possibly do. If he wore a wolf's skin, he was to all appearance a man-wolf, or werewolf. If a cow's skin, he was a cow. And so, as we have just seen in the Gaelic examples, and as more than one scholarly investigator has lately shown with regard to southern Britain, certain tribes became known by the names of certain beasts, which it was their fancy to resemble as nearly as possible in appearance. And hence inter alia, the talking animals of the legends. But the cow-headed warrior of the Iceland bronzes represents a development of this idea, for though still faithful to the brute similitude, he is cased in metal instead of hide. This is evident at a glance, so far at any rate as the headpiece is concerned. And it is the fellow of the bronze boarheads and others, which have been found in Scotland. And of the presence of such men in Scotland there is yet an echo. The scaly monsters of folklore were, Mr. Carl Blind suggests, no other than the invading Norsemen and Danes, clad in their scale armour. Now those scaly monsters are otherwise known to the Scottish peasantry by the name of Shelly-Coats, a name plainly given by a people unacquainted with scale armour. A Shelly-Coat became, after a long interval of time, dimly remembered as a wild creature emerging from the sea, and regarded, with too good reason, as an especial object of fear to the maidens of Britain. This, which is vehemently asserted in tradition, is discernible in Aileen of Alan Ramsay's, a line which also identifies the Shelly-Coat with such a man as the cow-helmed figure of Sealand. It occurs in The Gentle Shepherd, and the occasion is the abrupt flight of Jenny from her suitor. She fled as Freya Shelly-Coated cow. The lover complains, and you will find in Dr. Jameson's dictionary that a cow is still a Scottish equivalent for a bugbear or object of horror. Farther still, it is more fully styled a bucow, and this recalls the shout of bo, boo, or abu, said to have been the war cry of the ancient Irish. Now, this sound of bo or boo, which has given rise to the Gaelic name for a cow, bo, is nothing else than the bellow of cattle. And it is quite legitimate to assume that those tribes of ancient Irish who used this war shout did so because it was the roar of the creature they represented, and that such Irish were substantially the same people as the cow-warrior of Sealand and the tin-keards of Cornish tradition. But the Shelly-Coated cows and scaly monsters and of our peasantry were intruders and foreigners, and Mr. Blind identifies them with the Norsemen and Danes. The latter, I should think, for the Scottish peasant girl fled from the Shelly-Coats, actuated by the same fear that made the Prioress of Coldingham counsel her nuns to mutilate their faces, and so render them repulsive to the Danish banditti, the fear of outrage. The salient features of the brutal Dane of history and the quaintly named Shelly-Coat of peasant tradition are identical. Thus the so-called Irish to whom the war cry is attributed were only Irish in a sense. Their war cry is the property of the larger island as well, where it has been long embalmed in a popular saying. Thus we see that various tribes in Scotland and Ireland, as well as in England, whether in history or in legend, are known by the names of the totems they bear, and that some examples of such tribes are the dogs, cats, boars, cows, heifers, calves, and otters. Another clan is suggested by the old name of that part of Rossshire called the Black Isle, which was formerly, if not now, Edderdale, or the country of the adders. And this name again gives rise to another suggestion. The coloured amulets of glass and vitreous paste, which are found throughout the country, are known among the peasantry as Druids' beads, and also as adder stones. There is an ancient but manifestly absurd belief that these are in some mysterious way made from the saliva of serpents. This has been stated and restated in many forms, one of which I shall quote from the Gallividian Encyclopedia, that valuable, if somewhat motley collection of the wreckage of a remote past. The portion of the Pictish people which longest retained the name were the Picts of Galloway. Completely surrounded by the Britons of Strathclyde, and isolated from the rest of the Pictish nation, they maintained an isolated and semi-independent position in a corner of the island, and appear as a distinct people under the name of Picts as late as the 12th century, when adder beads made by adders. Such beads are common now in museums and other repositories of rarities. They are mostly about the size of a hazelnut, oval-shaped, of an amber hue, but full of specks of other beautiful colours. The hole through them is about 1/2 inch in diameter, and large enough to admit a child's little finger. That the adders make them is never doubted, but how is as yet never exactly known. The country people say it is gone about in this way. 7 old adders with manes on their backs have a meeting in some snug heather bush before the sun. With them is also a long small white one. Operations are begun by the hairy reptiles, putting forth from their mouths a glutinous matter of a honey colour. The white adder moulds this into a certain shape, forming the whole by creeping through it, and still as it creeps in through and out through the matter. The old ones keep salivating it. So the bead is constructed, and left to harden in the sun. But, add the peasantry, it is impossible to stand at any time, and behold them thus at work in their bead manufactory, as at these times they are full of wrath and swiftness, so that if the observer be seen by them, he has little chance to get off alive. Now this, as it stands, is sheer nonsense, but it may easily be the confused remembrance of a time when people of a wholly different race observed, from some hiding place, the fierce and alien tribe of snakes, mixing up the paste of which those amulets are formed. Ordinary adders do not have manes on their backs, but Cuthacks have, and if these latter detected one of the opposite race watching their movements from behind some cover, it is quite likely that they would be full of wrath and swiftness, and that the inquisitive observer would have little chance to get off alive. They formed one division of the Scottish army at the Battle of the Standard. If any part of the Pictish people might be expected to retain their peculiar language and characteristics, it would be the Picts of Galloway. We find, therefore, that in this remote district, in which the Picts remained under their distinctive names as a separate people as late as the 12th century, a language considered the ancient language of Galloway was still spoken as late as the 16th century. Skeeny's Celtic Scotland, Volume I, pp. 2034. Whatever the language was, it is evident from the facts just quoted that the traditions of this Galloway district are of interest. That there should be a white one among them is not surprising at a time when a great mixture of races was going on, or if one remembers that among the invading Mongolian hordes there were both white Huns and black Huns. So that, all things considered, it becomes very probable that the makers of the Druids' beads were Snake Indians, and that the memorable campaign of Patrick was against the same people. Buchanan, the distinguished tutor of James VI of Scotland, in the course of his description of the ancient inhabitants of Scotland, remarks as follows:
There are, besides, 2 ancient nations, the Mzeatai and Atacoti, placed by the Roman writers within the limits assigned to the kingdoms of the Scots and Picts. The Atacoti, according to Marcellinus, appear to have been those who were for some time excluded by the Wall of Adrian, but upon the extension of the Roman Empire, by the Wall of Severus, were included within the province, as in the book De Castrenibus Officis Romanorum per Provincias, on the camp services through the Roman provinces. Among the foreign auxiliaries, I find some cohorts of the Atacoti as well as the Britions. I am, therefore, at a loss whether to admire more the effrontery or the stupidity of Lloyd, his effrontery, in affirming the Atacoti to have been Scots, not only without any authority, but without the smallest shadow of a probable conjecture, or his stupidity in not perceiving, in the very passage he quotes from Marcellinus, that the Scots are distinguished from the Atacoti, for Marcellinus says that the Picts and Saxons, Scots and Atacoti, harassed the Britons with constant miseries.
And Aikman, in a footnote,
adds, "The Atticoti are only mentioned by the ancient writers, whom Buchanan quotes, and by St. Jerome, who characterizes them as delighting in the taste of human flesh. When they hunted the woods for prey, it is said they attacked the shepherd rather than his flock, and that they curiously selected the most delicate and brawny parts, both of males and females, for their horrid repast." Jerome, Torn, Chuihu, quoted by Gibbon. The character given by the saint, whose veracity, Gibbon says, "I see no reason to question," must of necessity have belonged only to some scattered savages. It never characterized the whole Scots, and corroborates the assumption that they, the Atticoti, were a distinct tribe. A modern writer, however, Richard of Cirencester, whose work has appeared since the days of Buchanan, differs in his statement as to age boundaries from our author. According to Richard, the Atticoti inhabited from Loch Fyne to Loch Lomond, comprehending the whole of Coval in Argyllshire and the greater part of Dunbartonshire.
Who the Atticoti were and the etymology of their name need not be here discussed. It is sufficient that in them we have one of those tribes, regarding whom reports of cannibalism were current in the days of Strabo. The practice of cannibalism must to some degree have continued for many centuries after the days of the Atticoti. Sir Walter Scott's story of Richard Sieur de Lion and the Saracen's Head, and the reputed cannibalism of the 17th century, of which he speaks in Woodstock, quoting the incident of the fine squab children who figure in the play of the old troupe, need not be historically true. But the very currency of such tales, and the fact that they were not scouted as utterly incredible, seem to suggest a substratum of truth underlying the fiction. Not only can we look back to those Argyllshire Atticoti, plainly pictured as cannibals, by a writer whose veracity Gibbon says I see no reason to question, but all over the country we have traditions of ogres, ugers, or ugrians, who carried off and ate children, while in Scotland there are several traditional instances of cannibalism within comparatively recent times. One of these is of a family of cave-dwellers on the coast of Forfarshire. This rocky coast is, in many places, hollowed out into large caves. In one of these most dismal caverns there lived in the 14th century a cannibal and his family who allured young men and children to his haunt and there devoured them. Pitscotty gives a very quaint account of the whole family being burned quick for their crime. Another and somewhat later example, being placed in the following century, is that of a Galloway clan, or family, who also inhabited a seaside cavern. These people were savages of the most degraded character. As soon as they had robbed any man, woman, or child, they used to carry off the carcass to the den. It is previously stated that they never robbed anyone whom they did not murder, where cutting it into quarters they would pickle the mangled limbs and afterwards eat it, this being their only sustenance. And notwithstanding they were at last so numerous, they commonly had superfluity of this, their abominable food, so that in the night time they frequently threw legs and arms of the unhappy wretches they had murdered into the sea, at a great distance from their bloody habitation. The limbs were often cast up by the tide in several parts of the country, to the astonishment and terror of all beholders, and others who heard of it. Here then is one of the most repulsive traits of savagery carried down to the very days of Chaucer, and farther. It is plain from the context of each of these recitals that the cases were isolated, but they were survivals of what had been a common practice of certain Scottish tribes. The most pleasing reflection for everyone now living in these islands is that those two families particularized cannot be numbered among our British ancestors, because in these, as in most other similar instances in which revolting savagery asserts itself among civilized people, the savages are not permitted to leave any posterity behind them. Nevertheless, we have no assurance that the very people who looked with such horror upon the anthropophagous tribes of Scotland and elsewhere were not, themselves, the remote descendants of cannibals. There are well-educated and refined people in Polynesia today who do not require to look farther back than one generation, to find the same custom practiced by their own people, and to whose children the fact will scarcely seem credible. A year or two ago, there was a report, contradicted afterwards and subsequently reaffirmed, that the king of Ashanti had caused 200 young girls to be slain, in order that their blood might be used for mixing up with the mortar employed in the building of his new palace. It was understood that the girls had been captured from some neighbouring tribe into whose territory the king's brother had made incursions, in order to procure the required number of victims. Whatever horrible superstition may have given rise to such a bloodthirsty custom, it was also practised by the savage blackamoors of early Scotland, if any faith is to be placed in tradition. Sir Walter Scott, in a note to the Count of Keeldar, tells us that castles remarkable for size, strength, and antiquity are, by the common people, commonly attributed to the Picts or Pecks, who are not supposed to have trusted solely to their skill in masonry in constructing these edifices, but are believed to have bathed the foundation stone with human blood in order to propitiate the spirit of the soil. And Hugh Miller, wandering among the ruins of Craighouse in Cromarty, encountered the same belief. This ruin, he states, was then supposed to be haunted by a spirit, regarding which, he says, "I remember getting the whole history of the goblin from a sunburnt herd boy, whom I found tending his cattle under the shadow of the old castle wall. I began by asking him whose apparition he thought it was that could continue to haunt a building, the very name of whose last inhabitant had been long since forgotten. 'Oh, they're saying,' was the reply, 'it's the spirit of the man that was killed on the foundation stone just after it was laid and then built until the way by the masons, that he might keep the castle by coming back again. And they're saying that how the verra old houses in the Kintra had murder it men builded intil them in that way, and that they have a owe them their bogle.' It is impossible to believe that such a custom as this was of spontaneous growth in early Scotland and in modern Africa. That, in each case, the perpetrators were of the black-skinned races, renders the assumption doubly sure that the common custom of these physically similar people had one common origin. Let me point out another coincidence. The high priests of certain races among the ancient Britons regarded the mistletoe with the greatest reverence, and the traditional honour bestowed upon this plant at the present day, by a nation composed chiefly of dark whites, shows the strength of the feeling. But of what race were the men who first reverenced the mistletoe? Perhaps the following quotation may help to answer the question. The times of offering sacrifice were in the spring and fall. Then the victim, self-appointed, or determined by lot as the case might be, repaired to the tent of the senior prophet, who, aided by his 4 junior associates, painted the face and adorned the body of the favoured victim with a covering of the mistletoe, that being the holiest and most rare of evergreens. But this is not the description of a religious ceremony among the British priests. It is a faithful account of an immemorial custom, practised by a Mongoloid nation on the other side of the Atlantic. That the mistletoe could be seized upon as the holiest of evergreens by 2 races that had never B.C. Jane connected is so unlikely as to be almost incredible. The readiest solution lying to hand is that this circumstance is a relic of the time when one homogeneous people occupied, if not a ring round the world, at least one reaching from Britain to Kamskatka. The same parallel is observable in a custom described by Martin in his description of the western islands of Scotland. All the inhabitants of Barre, an island of the Hebrides, Bar's Isle, observe the anniversary of St. Bar being the 27th of September. It is performed riding on horseback, and the solemnity is concluded by 3 turns round St. Bar's church. These islanders are even yet described as of tawny complexion, and if their physiognomy resembles that of many other Hebrideans, they are Mongoloids. And, just as the North American priest, sacrificing with the rites of the sun worshipper and the sacred plant of the mistletoe, bears a startling resemblance to the British priest of 18 centuries ago, so the solemnity of making the circuit, sunwise, of any sacred place for to go against the sun was simple profanity in the opinion of certain natives of Scotland at quite a recent date. A certain number of time forms another connecting link between the inhabitants of the same two countries. Indeed, the ceremonies of the American Indians, as pictured in the book just quoted from, are almost identical with those of certain of the early. Fall. Then the victim, self-appointed or determined by lot, as the case might be, repaired to the tent of the senior prophet, who, aided by his 4 junior associates, painted the face and adorned the body of the favoured victim with a covering of the mistletoe, that being the holiest and most rare of evergreens. But this is not the description of a religious ceremony among the British priests. It is a faithful account of an immemorial custom practised by a Mongoloid nation on the other side of the Atlantic. That the mistletoe could be seized upon as the holiest of evergreens by 2 races that had never been connected is so unlikely as to be almost incredible. The readiest solution lying to hand is that this circumstance is a relic of the time when one homogeneous people occupied, if not a ring round the world, at least one reaching from Britain to Kamskatka. The same parallel is observable in a custom described by Martin in his description of the western islands of Scotland. All the inhabitants of Barre, an island of the Hebrides, Bar's Isle, observe the anniversary of St. Bar being the 27th of September. It is performed riding on horseback, and the solemnity is concluded by 3 turns round St. Bar's church. These islanders are even yet described as of tawny complexion, and if their physiognomy resembles that of many other Hebrideans, they are Mongoloids. And, just as the North American priest, sacrificing with the rites of the sun-worshipper and the sacred plant of the mistletoe, bears a startling resemblance to the British priest of 18 centuries ago, so the solemnity of making the circuit, sunwise, of any sacred place, for to go against the sun was simple profanity in the opinion of certain natives of Scotland at quite a recent date. A certain number of times forms another connecting link between the inhabitants of the same two countries. Indeed, the ceremonies of the American Indians, as pictured in the book just quoted from, are almost identical with those of certain of the early.